So the middle of the 19th century, so from 1820 all the way up until 1861 with the official start of the Civil War in America, the Civil War started because there were these increasing tensions between the northern section of the country and the southern section of the country, or more appropriately, the free states where slavery was not allowed and citizens had quote unquote freedom, although with the assignment, with the article that we read in our last class, we know that freedom didn't really apply equally to everybody. And then the other section was the southern slavery section, where slavery was used. Slavery was seen as something that was necessary down there, and they kind of ignored the moral wrongs that went along with that institution. And those things really divided the country. So if you're to think of the country divided over what was the main thing that divided the country, it was slavery. So in 1820, there is the Missouri Compromise comes about because Missouri petitions to become a state. They petition Congress and say, we want to be added to the Union. So the question was, do we admit Missouri as a free state where slavery is not allowed, or do we admit them as a slavery state where slavery will be allowed? And because there's a balance, at that time, there were 22 states in the Union. 11 allowed slavery, 11 did not allow slavery. So adding Missouri on one side or the other was going to tip the balance of votes in Congress. It was going to tip the balance of representatives in Congress. So Henry Clay, who later became known as the Great Compromiser, had an idea and said, why don't we admit Missouri, but why don't we also admit another state? So Missouri is located right here in the heartland, or right in the belt of the American nation. But up here in the American Northeast, what is now the state of Maine, it used to belong to Massachusetts. So Congress said, why don't we take this part of Massachusetts up here, we'll divide it up and make that a new territory, a new state, and we'll call it Maine. And by adding a slavery state and a free state, they kept both sides happy. They kept the balance of power in Congress. And that's really what the big deal was here. It wasn't so much whether slavery should be allowed or not, but it was, we want to make sure that we are getting a fair shake when things go down in Congress. So the other thing that they established was, in the Missouri Compromise, they kind of drew a dividing line about halfway between the North and the South. And they said slavery would not be permitted anywhere north of Missouri. So as you look at this map on the slide here, all of these territories north of Missouri that are in gray, slavery would not be allowed. So in the western part of the nation, which was still not established yet, the question was going to be, so when new states, when new territories get admitted to the Union, will they allow slavery or not? And according to the Missouri Compromise, if they were north of Missouri, so this area right here, they were not allowed to have slavery. And we're going to learn shortly that that wasn't always followed through. So again, this compromise was a temporary solution, but it still left the country divided on the issue of slavery. A little bit later on, after the Mexican-American War in the 1830s, there was all this new land that was acquired from Mexico as part of the terms of the deal to stop the war and as part of that peace treaty, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And so Northerners said, with this new land, we want to make sure that there is no slavery that is allowed in those new territories. So any new territory that America acquires, Northerners said slavery should not be allowed. Southerners said, well, hold on, what makes you get the vote? That's going to, again, throw off the balance of representation and votes in Congress. So David Wilmot, who was a senator from Pennsylvania, proposed this ban on slavery in any new land out west. But because it had to go through a vote in Congress, and because Congress was equally divided, and any votes in Congress, in order to pass, they have to pass with a 2/3 vote in both the House and the Senate. So unless one section of the country had 2/3 or more representation, which they didn't, it was about 50-50, any law or any act dealing with slavery was most likely not going to get passed, and it would just kind of die out. And that's what happened to the Wilmot Proviso. So since the South opposed it, when they put it to a vote in Congress, half the members of Congress said, yes, we like this. We don't want slavery in any new land out west. But then the other half of the representation in Congress said, no, we don't want an imbalance in Congress. We're going to vote as Southerners that there is no ban on slavery. It should be up to those individual states. It should be up to the people who run that state. So that's the Wilmot Proviso. In 1850, we have a new state applying for statehood, and that's California. So again, not wanting to tip the scales of slavery states versus free states heavy in one direction or the other, Henry Clay, again, with the help of Daniel Webster, came up with this compromise and said, okay, we're going to do something that's going to favor the North and something that's going to favor the South. So to favor the North, they said, we're going to allow California to enter as a free state, right? So this made the South unhappy, and they said, well, wait a minute. Now we have 12 free states and 13 free states and only 12 slavery states. That's not fair. Any votes on that are going to go against us in Congress. We're not happy with that. So Clay said, all right, I've got something for you. And they passed what was known as the Fugitive Slave Law. And what that means is that any escaped enslaved person, any enslaved person that runs away, the federal law says that people, if they find out that there's an escaped enslaved person, they have to return them or turn them into the authorities. Because at this time, unfortunately, enslaved people were still considered property of Southern slave owners or enslavers. And so again, as part of this compromise to make the South happy and make the South feel like they got something out of this compromise, since the North got a free state added, California, this fugitive slave law was passed to make the Southerners feel like they were respected also. Of course, this made the North unhappy because it essentially forced people to return enslaved individuals back to their masters, back to the enslavers, and back into that life that they worked so hard to escape. So again, you can imagine this continued to divide the country because Northerners didn't want to go along with this, and many of them ignored it. Many of them broke this fugitive slave law, knowing that they would likely be put to jail or sent to jail for doing that. Because in today's society, we talked about it, anybody who is helping a crime to be committed or anybody who doesn't prevent a crime from being committed, they're considered an accessory or an accomplice. Even if their reasons are good, even if they're saying, well, these are human beings, I'm not going to go out of my way to put them back into bondage, the law did not see it that way, unfortunately. So fast forward to 1854. Again, we see that slavery continues to split the North and the South further and further apart. And it really came to an ugly head here in 1854 with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So again, when new territories apply for statehood, there's the question of will they be added as a slave state or as a free state? So Stephen Douglas, a senator from Illinois, which was in the North, said, let's divide this territory and let's let the people of those territories decide. That way, it's not on Congress. Congress didn't make the decision whether it's good or not good. It's the people of that state. And that's a problem that they'll have to deal with. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act, or the Kansas-Nebraska Compromise, if you want to call it that, was an attempt for Congress to kind of push the responsibility onto somebody else and let them get blamed if it's not a good thing. So again, popular sovereignty, voting would determine whether slavery would be allowed or not allowed. Well, this led to people illegally crossing into those territories, and when they were voting on whether that territory, Nebraska and Kansas, whether each of those would become a slavery state or whether it would become a free state, people were voting illegally, and that led to violence. So the South supported this idea and said, yeah, people should be able to vote. Northerners said no, because if people vote that in those states that slavery should be allowed, that's going to add not only one or two more slavery states to the Union, but it's continuing to allow this evil institution, this horrible injustice against humanity to continue. So Northerners also said, if you recall, the Missouri Compromise said nothing north of the Missouri line is slavery allowed to be existent. So this dark line here on the map, according to the Missouri Compromise, and this was called the Missouri Compromise line, anything north of that, it's already been enacted that slavery cannot exist anywhere north of here. So if there's any of these new territories, like in the New Mexico territory down here, if the citizens vote that they want slavery here because it's south of this Missouri Compromise line, then Northerners said, okay, that's part of the deal, and so be it. But anything north of this line, slavery is not allowed to exist because of the Missouri Compromise back in 1820. So Northerners said, you're going against your own laws, your own rules here. And people were fighting literally to the death to try and ensure that either slavery was allowed if people wanted it by Southerners, or Northerners ensuring that slavery was not going to be allowed. So there were threats, there were intimidations. People who were voting one way or the other were getting violently attacked. Some of them died. And this whole year and a half of violence that ensued was a time known as Bleeding Kansas, okay? Because quite literally, blood was being shed over this issue of slavery. And many consider the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854 really the final tipping point that made it inevitable that a civil war in America was going to take place.